This year's theme for Safer Internet Day is around an internet we trust. So really, how reliable is what we see in the online space? So I'm just going to do a very short a few slides about just being aware of fake news and information. Next slide, please, sir. Okay, so recent surveys show that around 80% of young people aged 16 to 24 use online news sources. And that's not surprising because many of us use online news sources more than we use, for example, newspapers. I can't remember the last time that I watched TV news live. I tend to watch things on demand or use a website. And so online news source is a very, very important source of news and current affairs. And because of that, it's really, really important that we know exactly what it is that we're seeing and that we can make choices and critically think about what we're seeing and whether it's really likely to be true. Next slide, please, sir. Okay, so online news, as opposed to, as I say, the TV, the radio, newspapers, does have some advantages. So you can get a wider range of news sources. In the UK, for example, I suppose there's about 10 mainstream newspapers. There are, a few mainstream news channels. So by using online news sources, we can get a much wider range of news sources. Obviously, it can be really, really up to date. So as soon as an event happens, if people are there, then they can obviously be live streaming that, or they can be taking short videos, or they can be tweeting about it. So we can get a lot of news that's completely up to date and firsthand rather than perhaps being reported by somebody else. It allows us as ordinary people, rather than people in power, to discuss and debate the news. It's not necessarily being filtered in the same way as it is if it's coming through the mainstream news outlets. And what that also means is that we might get a wider variety of different stories that get covered. So it might not just be about those big news corporations' agendas and what they want covering and what they think is important. It can be a much wider range of different stories. But there are some disadvantages, and it's really important that we are aware of those. If I read the Guardian newspaper, for example, I know that politically that's a left-wing newspaper, and all the stories in there are likely to be written and edited from that point of view. If I'm using an online news source, it might not be clear as to where the people that are writing or providing the story, where their political leanings are, or what their agendas might be, what things they're trying to get out to people, because I might not know that source as clearly as I do with an established news source. It might not have been fact checked in the same way. You know, we're very used to seeing fact checks on the mainstream sources. We know that journalists will usually go to sources before they report something and things like that. So it can be that it hasn't been fact checked, or it hasn't been fact checked to the same level as a mainstream news outlet. And the other thing we need to bear in mind is actually some of the stuff that's online, because it can be used to spread news and information quickly, might have been purely created to cause distress or confusion. And so important that we have got these things in the back of our mind when we're looking at these news sources. Next slide, please, sir. Okay, so when we're talking about fake news and information, this can happen deliberately or it can happen accidentally. So if I am somebody who has got a social media account and somebody shares something with me and I think, oh gosh, I think people ought to know about that, I might share it on. Now, if it turns out that information was wrong for some reason, then I've shared that on accidentally. It can still cause harm to other people and it can still cause problems, but that would be accidental. But there are reasons why people share false information deliberately. So sometimes at the lower end of things, it might just be people playing jokes or tricks or pranks, that type of thing. Moving up the scale, it might be people trying to scam you, trying to get your money or your personal details to defraud you. It might be people that are trying to spread a particular point of view or belief. And bear in mind that that could include politicians, it could include the government. So it's kind of what we'd call propaganda, but it could include conspiracy theorists who aren't people in power, but who want to publicise their particular point of view. Or it could just be people trying to get likes or follows or contacts on social media or other online platforms, probably to make money if they're going to do that. Next slide, please, sir. Okay, so I've just got a couple of examples of the sorts of things that I'm talking about here. So the left-hand example is something that was put out couple of years ago, just over a couple of years ago, by Burger King, and it's the start of a new type of burger, a chocolate Whopper. And this has all sorts of sweet and sickly things in it rather than the usual savoury things that we might expect. Now, this was put out as an April Fool's joke. So 1st of April in the UK is April Fool's Day. And if you play a joke before 12 o'clock, you'll see a lot of the newspapers, a lot of the online outlets will be having joke stories. And it's just a sort of a strange thing that happens here. And that was just a joke and a prank. And there wasn't really any negative impact as a result of that. It was just for fun. The middle one there, I'm not sure if you can see the picture very clearly, is there were a number of social media posts similar to this that were put out earlier in the pandemic. And this shows kind of empty hospital corridor and a ward within the United Kingdom. And the narrative that was going alongside this, or these types of posts, was that the UK hospitals weren't full, they weren't struggling, and that COVID wasn't really a problem. And of course, if people are posting those types of things, there's a couple of different things that where there could be impacts, quite serious impacts. People might see that and believe it and feel that actually COVID's not very serious, and therefore I don't need to protect myself, I don't need to protect others, and potentially then spread the virus around more. People could obviously get ill who wouldn't have otherwise got ill, and we know unfortunately that it can be very serious for people. But the other thing that happened as a result of this is that some of the workers within the NHS were being targeted, as saying, well, you know, why aren't you treating us in the hospitals? Why can't I have my operation? And getting abuse and those types of things, because people were saying, well, the hospitals aren't full. So different sorts of impacts there. On the right-hand side, you probably recognise there that's an account that belongs to Donald Trump. And relatively recently, you will remember the American election, the US election, that Mr. Porter kept us all up to date with. And you will remember that he made quite bold claims that the election had been stolen from him. And you'll see there it says, we're up big, but they're trying to steal the election. What you'll see there is that if you can see the text just above in that little box, is that Twitter were actually putting labels on his posts, really saying that they weren't reliable. You know, and eventually they did ban his account. Unfortunately, as you might remember, there were riots at the Capitol building and people lost their lives. And this sort of very angry and particularly inaccurate information possibly cost those people their lives, because they were people that believed what he was saying and they believed passionately in it. So actually, in that case, obviously very serious impacts. Next slide, please, sir. Okay, so just a few more things in terms of what the impacts can be. Unfortunately, we have seen these kind of posts using to target specific groups. For example, racist posts, people causing physical damage. So there were a whole lot of social media last year saying that 5G phone masts were causing illness, and there were then a number of people who went and destroyed those masts. We've already seen things that create drama and outrage and that sort of thing. It can ruin people's lives if untrue things are written about them, and it gets shared on. It can cause people to do harm or injury to themselves or to others. So if you get fake weight loss tips and things like that, and it can also have quite significant effects on mental health, depending on the content. So lots of reasons why we all need to look out for this kind of information. Next slide, please, sir. So what can we do? So what we need to do when we're seeing information or news in front of us is before we believe it, and certainly before we pass that information on and share it to other people, we can think about this acronym here, SHARE. So the first thing we need to think about is the source. Is, does this information come from a trusted source? If it just comes from somebody's aunt or something, then we don't know whether that's a trusted source or not. Make sure it's coming from somewhere that's likely to be telling you the truth. Don't just look at the headlines. Sometimes the headlines appear to say one thing, and when you read the whole story, it actually says something really different. So make sure you have read the whole article before you decide, when you make a decision about whether it's true, and before you pass it on. Analyze the facts. Is there information in there that just is really, really unlikely to be true? It's amazing how much rubbish people will write, and we have to all look at what's there and make sure that it does seem to make sense. Check it on other websites if we're not sure. Where we've got images and videos, does it look as if it's been retouched? Does it look as if it's got filters on it? Does it look as though that's actually really the image that it's claiming to be? If it says this is an image of Bournemouth Beach today, is it really, or is it somewhere else, or is it Bournemouth Beach on a different day? You need to be thinking about whether that image is likely to be true. And then the last thing is look out for errors. If you've got situations where you've got bad grammar, spelling, and other errors that you can spot, it's quite likely that that information isn't information we should be believing and isn't information we should be passing on. Okay, so hopefully that's just a few tips on what we should be doing, making sure that we're critically thinking about all this information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis, and what we should be doing to make sure that we're not passing on incorrect information and leading to some of those really horrible impacts that we saw on some of the previous slides.